But just while you're thinking about your questions, I'll kick off. I'm interested to know, we're talking about getting fit for the future, and if we think of ourselves, when we think about getting fit for the future, one of the first things we might do is jump on the bathroom scales and figure out how much we actually weigh and how much it is we want to lose. Do people actually know enough about their buildings and how they actually perform? Picking up on one of Joel's last points there, do people know how to measure the performance of their buildings? And if not, what are we going to have to do about that? Start with Lynn maybe and come along the panel if you've got any comments.
It's amazing, isn't it, how many people know they need to lose weight but do nothing about it. I think it's pretty similar in the building stock. Most people know that there are things that they could do and know that the building is not as efficient as it might be, but actually find that the whole concept of carbon loss, weight loss, whatever, quite intimidating. I think it's helped a lot by display energy certificates in the non-domestic market, and I think that movement is going to help take things forward. When you start to look at domestic properties, though, I think most people just assume that they pay their bill and that's just what they do. I don't think there is significant understanding of what's going on. I think with real-time metering, as that gets installed in homes, that will certainly help on the domestic side. In the non-dom side, where your utility bills are included in your rental, it's almost invisible. So unless we see some kind of separation of bills from a rental charge, which hopefully the CRC may start to bring out, I think we're a bit stuffed because people just don't see the results of behaviour.
Thank you. I mean, David, you started to talk about the danger, if I can put it that way, of a two-tier market emerging. I mean, do you think people know which tier they're likely to fall into? Do people know if they've got a weight problem in this particular sector?
Well, what we found working with commercial property clients on getting them ready for CRC and then how they're going to implement processes to actually comply with it is the challenge of getting data together to cover their portfolios was astonishing. The number of clients who simply hadn't in the past ever had to provide that information, and the task of simply pulling together information on energy use in their buildings, breakdowns by tenant in their buildings, where they've got sub-metering, where they haven't got sub-metering, drawing a red line around the emissions for an organisation which is owning significant amounts of commercial property was a real challenge administratively for a lot of clients. So probably that has moved them quite a step forward, but they certainly didn't have that data in place prior to that.
Okay, and Joel, I mean, Prupim have been a leader in this space for a very long time. They were one of the first big institutional investors with property interest to be looking at this, screening their portfolios in terms of sustainability with one or two others such as Hermes. Is this now becoming a mainstream phenomenon amongst your competitors? Do you think all the institutional investors are starting to check out the fitness of their buildings?
It's certainly becoming a lot more mainstream. We're seeing a lot more movement in this area, and particularly in our sector. With the carbon reduction commitment, as David's already pointed out, it really resets the baseline though, and so even though we've been very forward thinking for many years now, it brings everyone up to a certain level of understanding where they all of a sudden have to capture the energy performance of their buildings. So I think it's going to actually do a lot of good for the industry, and it'll actually take some time before the leaders actually start to poke their head above the parapet again, but no, it's very good.
Thank you. I mean, for my part, I have to say that I think the sooner we see the systematic rolling out of display energy certificates, the better. As we've all seen, we've seen the rolling out of energy performance certificates, which is a good start, but of course that only gives you a theoretical asset rating, and what we've seen from the DECs that have come out for public buildings so far, there are some very, very big disparities between how people think a building will perform and how it tends to perform, sometimes to a factor of 100% or more. Okay, I want to open this up. Would you like to indicate if you'd like to ask one of our panelists a question, or just throw in your opinion for that matter? Who would like to be the first to go? Gentleman at the back there. Yeah.
Hi there, just a question to the panel. How do you see the sort of demolishing of buildings or the replacement of buildings be affected by the new agenda? How do you see that playing out? When do companies make the decision to retire a building and just say we're going to start again?
Very good question. So the question is, when do companies decide to actually pull a building down and start again? I mean, one of the things that interests me is perhaps the slight differences that play out here between our homes and our other buildings. We have traditionally a strong emotional attachment to our older homes. We like Victorian terraces, we like Georgian townhouses. We're perhaps a little bit more ruthless with regards to our non-domestic buildings, or are we? I mean, David, what do you think from a Knight Frank perspective on that?
I mean, refurbishing buildings rather than knocking them down and building them again is fundamentally more sustainable practice. You lock up a lot of carbon in a building when you build it, you release that when you knock it down, and then you do it again. The average life cycle of a commercial building, very few get beyond 30 years without having some substantial refurbishment done to them, or just to release land value, knock it down and build something bigger on the site. So there's that element to it, but there's also the fact that there's going to be some interesting new approaches, I think, given that the fundamental element of value related to a building which now links to carbon means that someone looking at an energy inefficient building over the life cycle of that building and the carbon liability that they will have on perhaps quite an old energy inefficient building may actually make the investment case for knocking it down and building something new and energy efficient a more appealing proposition than it was, depending on whether or not they're seeing themselves as carrying that liability over the lifetime of the building. So yeah, I think the monetization of environmental performance in buildings that has come through putting a carbon price on occupying property or owning property may well change some of the business cases for knocking buildings down and rebuilding new ones. But fundamentally, if you can do things with buildings to make them more efficient without knocking them down, then that's better.
Joel, is that something you wanted to add to, or?
Well, I just think it's something the property sector has to be very careful of. With the rating of buildings being much more visible now, we do run the risk of actually the lower rated buildings actually become obsolete a lot quicker. So we have to be very careful that we're not knocking buildings down before they actually should be. And it's very much what David was touching on, is always looking at sustainable refurb or retrofit options before we actually go that far. There's a lot of good resources out there that can actually assist with refurbishing and retrofitting in a more sustainable manner.
Lynn?
And I think this has to be a question for the type of building that we put up in the first place. If you look at some of the older buildings in London, you know, the old warehouses and such like, which have been adapted very successfully to new office blocks and such like, there is no need to knock them down. But if we're starting to build the out-of-town retail shed, that probably would go very, very fast, because it's something, I think, a question for designers. Should we be looking to actually design short lifetime buildings in such a way that they can be deconstructed? So as you mentioned, in trying to recapture the value of the carbon that's gone into making the building, I think it's actually a design question now. How do we design buildings to be deconstructed rather than demolished, if we accept they're going to have a very short lifespan?
And that's something we've seen in the Olympics, I guess. We've seen quite a lot of that sort of discussion.
Yep.
I mean, I think one of the other interesting things about the difference between our non-domestic buildings and our homes, as I said, we tend to have this emotional attachment perhaps to our older homes and so on. But it's been recently highlighted to me how with our non-domestic buildings, actually the supply chains around designing and building new buildings are actually very, very closely related for those for refurbishing non-domestic buildings. There isn't such a big gap as there is in the housing market. So maybe the trajectory that we might embark on for zero carbon new buildings can actually bring with it a lot more refurbishment activity to upgrade our existing stock. Who else would like to chip in with a question or a comment? You're all being very shy this morning, or somebody must have a provocative view or disagree violently with something we've said. Or is there an overwhelming consensus? So looking, there's an overwhelming consensus, or perhaps people just haven't woken up yet. All right, I'll let you off for a moment more, and I'll ask another question. One of the things that pulled me up short recently was I was talking to a scientist from Hungary who actually has led the team for the IPCC historically doing their work on buildings, and in fact is the scientist that produced what's become in the sector an infamous graph that shows the carbon saving potential of our buildings as being so much greater than any other sector. And she said the thing that really worries her now is what she calls the lock-in effect, and she's about to produce another load of research around this, showing that actually it could be more dangerous to get in and just pick the low-hanging fruit and do light refurbishment than doing nothing at all. Because psychologically, if we go into our buildings and we think, oh, we've done some refurbishment, we've stuck a bit more insulation in a loft, we're sorted. Actually, what we're going to be doing is locking in a hell of a lot more carbon for many decades to come, and we can't afford to do that in the overall scheme of things. I mean, what do the panel think about that? Do we think, I mean, in your experience, Joel, are we just going to fall into this trap of picking the low-hanging fruit? Or have you got examples of where you've already seen people take this much deeper and achieve much bigger carbon reductions?
I think it all depends on what budgets allow you to do, but if you're going to be installing expensive capital investment into new boiler and efficiency equipment, I really think you need to capitalise on the low and no cost easy options, because that sort of resets your baseline, and then you've got something better to work with before you start making the more capital investment and the more hefty investments into your properties. So whilst I respect what your colleagues' advice is coming out, I do think that the low-hanging fruit is probably a good option to go after in the first instance.
Any other views on that one?
I'll pick up. I think this is similar to the argument between green bling and invisible green, really. You'll see I advise planning authorities quite a lot when new development proposals come in, and it's amazing how many really rubbish design buildings come in with a windmill on the top, which is supposed to address all the sustainability concerns, and I would refer to that really as green bling. And yet when you talk to other businesses, Marks and Spencers and others, and say to them, what are you doing with your stock? You can't see what they do, but it's having much more profound effects. But it doesn't actually have the PR value or the visual value that a lot of companies want for their CSR, or for people to actually be able to see from the street. I think this is where we come back to how do you make it visible what you're actually doing. And I agree. I think for some investment returns, you do have to pick off low-hanging fruit. But if we're going to make a meaningful contribution to climate change mitigation, we actually have to take some bigger bites.
I think the point that I tried to make around aggregating demand is very important, because the public purse is never going to be able to stump up retrofit budgets to the tune of, last time I heard London was talking about 40 billion to retrofit domestic, excluding actually commercial property in London. So the idea that someone would come along without an investment case that stacks up and put that kind of money in is unrealistic, I think. So how we can actually aggregate a demand side so that there is an attractive proposition there, and we actually have the contractual basis and the verification for pay-as-you-save schemes, so people can say, I'll pay X amount up front and get it paid back over 30 years or 20 years or 10 years because they like the look of that business model, and it can be secure. It's very difficult when you're looking at so many different ownerships of property. Local authorities are in quite a strong position because they can actually use their estates to drive that demand side. Same for the NHS, same for other organisations that have a kind of centralised control of their property. But when you're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of separate ownerships and how you can aggregate that demand, it's a very difficult task to provide a delivery model that can actually do that.
Lynn, did you want another word?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on that because I think David makes an interesting point. If you treat a building on a standalone basis, it's extremely difficult to make it low carbon in terms of energy supply and such like, particularly when you're talking about district heating or community heating schemes. We may find a more economic answer in actually dealing with buildings on an area basis, because you could save the same amount of carbon by spending less on an adjoining building, or by working together, or by aggregating demand. And I think one of the big flaws in the current planning system, the current way we look at carbon, is we draw a red line around the property. That red line has to be permeable. We're going to have to start thinking of it in the same way we did about cable TV or the installation of natural gas. You don't do that one property at a time. It doesn't work.
Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Is anybody now itching, jumping up and down on their cushion? Yes, there's a lady at the front here.
Hi, I was particularly focusing this on Joel, and it's around how you get your information around investments. I know a lot of businesses writing reports, CR reports, various other means, and how much does that information influence the decisions that you're making? And if it doesn't, what does?
There's a lot to be gained from outside research and what's going on in the market, and that's part of what my company has, or the company I work for has to maintain a good knowledge of. We're fortunate enough to have a well-renowned research team as part of our company that keeps on top of this and actually forecasts how the markets are shifting and different sectors need to be approached. There's a lot of really good research coming out, as I mentioned when I was speaking, from the Netherlands, Maastricht University, They're doing a lot of research in the States as well. So there's a lot of regional information that we can start to compare the UK sector with, for example, the US, Europe and Australia. There's a lot going down in Australia where they've got a lot more modern new build stock, so we can see how they're starting to implement the sustainable design into their buildings and what impact it has on newer stock as opposed to older stock. So.
Okay, we're almost out of time. For me, I've witnessed a revolution over the last 3 years in the way that house builders have approached energy efficiency and the challenge of zero carbon. 3 years ago, a minister stood up and said from 2016 you're going to have to build zero carbon homes. Here's the code for sustainable homes. Here's a 10-year trajectory with 3 big step changes. The house building industry responded phenomenally. Within 9 months, Barratt's, one of our biggest house builders, went out and produced a zero carbon prototype 9 years ahead of regulation. That was pretty unheard of in the house building industry, I have to say. So my question to the panel, just by way of closing, and I'm going to be mean and ask for a yes or no answer, is the government of any colour after our election going to have to regulate for energy efficiency improvements for our existing homes and buildings? I'd really like to keep you to a yes-no answer if at all possible, starting with Lynn.
Yes.
David?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
Excellent. All those politicians out there, I know John Gummer's somewhere around, perhaps he can feed that back to his colleagues. Thank you all very much indeed for listening and taking part, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the exhibition. Thank you.